You? My boss. Richard Whitmore's laugh cracked through the boardroom like it didn't just belong to him. It owned the air, sharp and confident, echoing off the glass walls 30 floors above Manhattan. And a few others followed, quieter, safer laughs, the kind that only existed when power had already decided the outcome. But Naomi Brooks didn't laugh, didn't even blink. She just stood there at the edge of the room with a thin folder in her hand. Her uniform pressed, but plain, the faint scent of industrial cleaners still clinging to her sleeves, like the building itself had marked her as someone who wasn't supposed to cross this invisible line. The line between service and authority, between being seen and being dismissed. And still she stepped forward, one measured step at a time, her shoes making a soft, steady sound against the polished floor that somehow felt louder than Richard's voice, louder than the silence that followed it. "This is a private meeting," Richard added, leaning back in his leather chair, fingers tapping once against the mahogany table as if he had already moved on, as if she had already disappeared. "You're in the wrong place." But Naomi kept walking, her reflection sliding across the glass wall beside her, doubling her presence in a room that wasn't built for her. And for a brief second, someone at the far end of the table glanced up, not with annoyance, not with amusement, but with something quieter, something closer to curiosity, like they were watching something they didn't fully understand yet. Naomi reached the table and placed the folder down in front of Richard, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough for the edge of the paper to touch his watch, the faintest contact, but it stopped his fingers from tapping, and that was the first shift, small, almost invisible, but real. "Actually," she said, her voice calm, not loud, not trembling, just steady enough to cut through the room without forcing it. "I'm exactly where I need to be." A few heads tilted, a few eyes narrowed, and the laughter that had filled the space just seconds ago didn't return. It couldn't, because something had changed in the rhythm of the room, something subtle, but undeniable. Richard looked down at the folder, then back up at her, his expression not angry, not yet, just dismissive, the kind of look reserved for interruptions that didn't matter. "Security will handle this," he said, barely turning his head. But no one moved. Not immediately, because the man seated 2 chairs down had already reached forward, almost without thinking, his fingers brushing the top page as if pulled by instinct rather than permission. He flipped it open, slowly, carefully, and the soft sound of paper turning filled the silence that had replaced the laughter. Naomi didn't move, didn't speak again. She just stood there, shoulders squared but relaxed, like she had already said everything she needed to say. Like the rest of this moment didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the truth sitting in ink on those pages. "What is this?" Richard muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But the man reading didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning, then stopping, then going back, like he needed to read it twice to be sure. "Richard," he said finally, his voice lower now, "careful. You might want to take a look." And that was the second shift, because now it wasn't Naomi asking to be heard. It was someone inside the circle, someone who already belonged. And that carried a different weight, a weight Richard couldn't ignore so easily. He exhaled through his nose, irritated, leaning forward just enough to glance at the page, his hand brushing against the document. And for a split second, his reflection in the glossy surface of the table didn't look as certain as it had before. Naomi watched him, not with defiance, not with satisfaction, just with quiet patience. Like someone who had been underestimated so many times that proving people wrong no longer felt like victory, just inevitability. And somewhere in the room, the air conditioning hummed a little louder, or maybe it just felt that way because no one else was making a sound anymore. No one laughing, no one whispering, just eyes shifting between the paper and the girl who wasn't supposed to be there, the girl who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded attention, hadn't needed to, and as Richard's gaze moved across the lines in front of him, something behind his eyes tightened, not enough for anyone to call it fear, not yet, but enough to break the rhythm of his certainty, enough to make the room feel different, like the balance had shifted by an inch, and in rooms like this, an inch was everything. Richard did not speak right away, and that was the third shift because a man like him always had something to say, and the absence of his voice stretched across the table like a crack in glass, subtle, but impossible to ignore. His fingers pressed flat against the paper now, no longer tapping, no longer in control of the rhythm, and across from him the man who had opened the document leaned back slightly, eyes still locked on the page as if the words might change if he blinked too long. This transfer date, he murmured, not finishing the sentence, not needing to, because the weight of it was already there, hanging between them. Naomi remained standing, her posture unchanged, her hands resting loosely at her sides, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. And that presence alone felt out of place in a room that had spent years deciding who mattered and who did not. Richard finally lifted the top page, slower this time. Not dismissive anymore, but careful, like he understood that. Whatever he was about to confirm could not be undone. The faint rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have, amplified by the silence that no one dared to break. His eyes moved line by line, then stopped, then moved back again. And for a brief second his jaw tightened, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it panic, but enough for the chairman at the head of the table to notice. "Is there a problem?" the chairman asked, his tone neutral, but his attention sharp now, fully engaged. Richard did not answer immediately, which only made the question heavier, and the man beside him exhaled slowly, turning the document so the chairman could see. "This is not a standard proxy," he said, voice low, controlled. "This is full transfer of controlling shares." The words settled into the room like dust that had been waiting years to fall. Naomi's gaze did not move. She did not look at the chairman, did not look at the others. Her eyes remained on Richard, not challenging him, not pressing him, just holding steady, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. The chairman reached forward, adjusting his glasses slightly as he read, and unlike the others he did not rush, he did not skim. He read every line, every clause, every signature. The seconds stretched, then folded into something longer, something heavier, until finally he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. "When was this executed?" he asked, still looking at the page. 3 weeks ago," Naomi answered, her voice the same as before, calm, grounded, and for the first time since she entered the room no one interrupted her, no one dismissed her. Because now the question was not why she was here, it was how none of them had known. Richard's grip on the paper tightened just slightly, the edge bending beneath his thumb, and he looked up at her again, really looked. This time, not at her uniform, not at the role he had assigned to her, but at her face, her composure, the certainty that had been there from the moment she stepped forward. "This is not possible," he said, but the words lacked the force they had carried before. They sounded thinner now, like they were trying to convince him as much as anyone else. The chairman closed the folder slowly, placing his hand on top of it as if sealing the moment in place. "It is possible," he replied, his tone no longer neutral, no longer distant, but firm in a way that did not need to rise. And around the table, chairs shifted slightly, not in chaos, not in panic, but in quiet recalibration, the kind that happens when power changes direction without warning. Naomi took a small breath, almost unnoticeable, and for a fraction of a second her shoulders softened before returning to stillness. She had not raised her voice, had not demanded recognition, and yet the room had moved, inch by inch, toward her, and now there was nowhere else for it to go but forward. No one reached for their phones, and no one spoke out of turn because something unspoken had taken hold of the room, something heavier than authority and sharper than doubt. And Richard felt it before he understood it. The way the air seemed to press in closer, the way the usual confidence in his posture no longer fit quite right, like a suit tailored for a different version of him. He placed the document back on the table, but did not let go of it immediately, his fingers lingering on the edge as if holding onto it could somehow delay what it meant. Across from him Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just grounding herself in that exact spot. The same spot he had dismissed seconds ago, and the chairman's gaze moved between them, measuring, calculating, not emotionally but structurally, because this was not about pride anymore. It was about control. "We need verification," one of the senior board members said, his voice careful, almost cautious, like he was stepping onto uncertain ground, and the chairman nodded once, already reaching for the intercom at his side, pressing the button with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have. "Have legal come up," he said, his tone even, practiced, But the fact that he had said it at all changed the atmosphere again. Because now this was no longer an interruption. It was a process, and processes in rooms like this did not begin unless something real was at stake. Richard leaned back slowly, finally releasing the paper, his hands folding together in front of him. A gesture that used to signal control, but now looked more like containment. His eyes flicked to Naomi again, searching for something, a crack, a hesitation, any sign that this was a mistake that could be corrected. But she gave him nothing, just that same calm presence, the same quiet certainty that had not shifted since she walked in, and that absence of fear unsettled him more than anything else. The seconds stretched as they waited, the city beyond the windows continuing without them, cars moving, people walking, unaware that something inside this room had just tilted. A quiet chime sounded as the elevator doors opened somewhere down the hall, followed by the faint echo of footsteps approaching, steady, unhurried, each step drawing the moment tighter, more defined, until the door to the boardroom opened and two members of the legal team stepped inside, carrying tablets, their expressions neutral but alert. They had been summoned into something important, even if they did not yet know what. "We need immediate confirmation on a share transfer," the chairman said without preamble, sliding the folder toward them, and one of the attorneys picked it up, scanning the first page quickly before slowing down, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as he realized the scope of what he was reading. "This is," he began, then stopped, choosing his next words more carefully. "This appears to be a controlling transfer agreement." Richard exhaled once, sharp but contained. "Appears to be is not confirmation," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its earlier edge, grasping for certainty, for authority, for anything that could re-establish the ground beneath him. The attorney nodded slightly, not dismissing him but not yielding either. "We will confirm," he replied, already tapping on his tablet, cross-checking signatures, timestamps, registration records, and Naomi watched all of it without interruption, her gaze steady, her breathing even, because she had already lived through the moment they were just now entering. She had already signed what needed to be signed, already stepped into a reality they were still trying to accept. And as the attorney's eyes moved faster across the screen, something in his expression tightened, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And when he finally looked up, the room did not feel the same anymore, because everyone could see it in his face before he said a single word, and even Richard felt it, the last thin thread of denial pulling tight inside his chest as the truth moved closer to being spoken out loud. The attorney did not rush his words, and that alone told everyone in the room that this was no longer routine. His eyes lifted from the tablet to the chairman first, not to Richard, not to Naomi, but to the only seat that still represented structure. "The transfer has been registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission," he said, each word measured, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, filled with the quiet collapse of assumptions that had stood unchallenged for years. Richard's fingers tightened together, the subtle shift of his posture revealing more than any reaction could have, because this was not a disagreement he could argue, not a decision he could override. This was record, law, fact, something that existed beyond the room and yet had just rewritten everything inside it. "There must be an error," he said, but even as he spoke, the certainty that had once defined his voice had thinned, stretched too far to hold its original weight. The attorney did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned the tablet slightly, placing it on the table where the chairman could see, where anyone could lean forward and confirm it for themselves. Timestamps, signatures, digital seals, all aligned with a precision that left no room for doubt. "The majority stake now belongs to Naomi Brooks," he continued. And this time the words did not just land, they settled, anchoring themselves into the structure of the room. The chairman leaned back slowly, absorbing it, not emotionally but procedurally, recalibrating roles, authority, order, and for the first time since Naomi entered, he looked directly at her, not as an interruption, not as a question, but as the center of the conversation. "Is there anything you would like to add?" he asked, and the shift was complete, subtle but absolute. Because now the room was not deciding whether she belonged. It was waiting for her to speak. Naomi did not answer right away. She allowed the moment to exist, to breathe, her gaze moving briefly across the table, not to measure anyone, not to claim anything, but simply to acknowledge the space that had changed around her. Then she stepped forward one final time, reaching for the chair at the head of the table, the same chair that had remained untouched, unquestioned. Until now, her hand rested on the back of it for a fraction of a second, not hesitating, just marking the transition, and then she pulled it out, the soft sound of it moving against the floor, cutting cleanly through the silence. She sat down with the same calm she had carried since the beginning. No urgency, no performance, just presence. And across from her Richard watched, not with disbelief anymore, not entirely, but with something more complicated, something closer to recognition, as if he was finally seeing the moment he had already lost. "We will proceed with the meeting," the chairman said, but his tone had shifted, no longer leading, no longer directing, just aligning with what had already been established. Naomi placed her hands lightly on the table, her posture steady, her voice when it came just as controlled as before. "Let us begin with the agenda," she said, and there was no need to raise it, no need to assert it, because the room had already adjusted, already moved, already accepted what the documents had confirmed, and in that quiet transition, without confrontation, without force, everything had changed in a way that no one in the room could undo. No one reached for the printed agenda because the paper no longer defined what would happen next. Naomi's voice had already done that, quiet and steady, and the shift in control was not announced but felt in the way chairs adjusted, in the way eyes moved toward her without being told, in the way even the smallest sounds seemed to wait for her to continue. She glanced down at the documents in front of her, not to search, not to prepare, but simply to align the moment with the purpose she had walked in with. "Before we move forward," she said, her tone even, grounded, "there is one item that needs immediate attention." And the phrasing was careful, not confrontational, not dramatic, just precise enough to redirect the entire room. The chairman nodded once without speaking, granting space without needing to declare it, and Naomi reached for a second folder she had carried in with her, placing it gently on the table. The soft contact of paper against wood drawing attention again, but this time not as interruption, as intention. "This company has been operating under a set of assumptions," she continued, her gaze moving briefly across the board members, not lingering, not judging, just acknowledging, about leadership, about oversight, and about who is responsible for long-term risk. Richard shifted slightly in his seat, not enough to interrupt, but enough to signal that the words had landed where they needed to. His posture still composed but no longer relaxed, his attention now fixed on her in a way it had not been before, not dismissing, not challenging, just listening. And that alone marked a difference that no one in the room could ignore. Naomi opened the folder, sliding a document toward the center where it could be seen. "Over the past 12 months," she said, "there have been 3 major decisions that increased exposure without adequate review." The room remained still, but the tension had changed, no longer about her presence, but about the content she was bringing forward. The quiet hum of the air system filled the space between her words, each sentence settling before the next began. "I am not here to revisit those decisions," she added, her voice softening slightly, not in weakness but in clarity. "I am here to make sure they do not happen again." And the distinction mattered. It removed the expectation of confrontation and replaced it with something more controlled, more deliberate, the kind of authority that did not need to prove itself because it was already established. The chairman leaned forward slightly, hands folded, his focus fully aligned now. "What are you proposing?" he asked, and Naomi met his gaze directly, her expression unchanged, her confidence not louder but more defined. "A restructuring of oversight," she said, "beginning with an independent review committee that reports directly to the board." A few members exchanged brief glances, not in resistance but in recalculation, the kind that happens when a new direction is introduced without force. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers resting flat against the table again, but this time not tapping, not signaling impatience, just steady, contained. "And who would lead this committee?" he asked, his voice measured, careful, not confrontational but not yielding either. Naomi did not hesitate. "I will," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it was not a request, not a negotiation, just a statement aligned with everything that had already been confirmed. The room absorbed it without reaction, without objection, because the structure had already shifted to make space for it. And in that quiet acceptance, something deeper settled into place, not just authority, but direction, not just control, but purpose. And for the first time since she entered, the room no longer felt like something she had stepped into. It felt like something she was shaping. The word hung in the air for a moment longer than it should have, not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear, too direct to be ignored or softened. And Naomi did not look away after she said it. She did not shift in her chair or adjust her posture. She simply remained still, letting the weight of it settle without forcing it further. And across the table, a subtle ripple moved through the room, not visible in gestures, but in attention, in the way every person recalculated their position without speaking. The kind of shift that happens when authority does not raise its voice, but redefines the structure beneath everyone. The chairman studied her for a second longer, then nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Noted," he said, and the acknowledgement carried more than agreement. It carried alignment, because now the proposal was no longer an idea. It was a direction, one that had already begun to take shape. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze still fixed on Naomi, but the look in his eyes had changed again, not dismissive, not even resistant, but searching, like he was trying to understand not just what had happened, but how it had happened without him seeing it sooner. His voice, when it came, was quieter, measured in a way that suggested control but also caution. "You are proposing a structural shift within a single meeting," he said, not accusing, not approving, just stating the scale of what she had introduced. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without retreating from it. "I am proposing clarity," she replied, her tone even. "The structure was already unstable. I am just making it visible." And the distinction landed cleanly, because it reframed the conversation from change to correction, from disruption to necessity. A board member on the far side of the table adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly. "What would the timeline look like?" he asked, his voice careful but engaged, and Naomi answered without hesitation. "Initial review within 30 days. Full implementation within 90. The precision of it removed doubt, not by force but by preparation, by the quiet indication that she had not walked into this room reacting. She had walked in ready. The attorney who had verified the documents glanced down at his tablet again, then back up, as if confirming that everything unfolding aligned not just with intention, but with governance. And the chairman folded his hands, considering for a moment before speaking. "We will need formal documentation," he said, not as a challenge, but as a step forward. And Naomi nodded once. "It is already prepared," she said, sliding another document across the table. And that was the moment the last layer of uncertainty dissolved, because there was no hesitation left, no gap between proposal and execution. Everything she presented was complete, aligned, deliberate. Richard's gaze followed the movement of the paper, his jaw tightening slightly, not in anger but in recognition, because the pace of the room was no longer his to control, and that realization settled into him more deeply than any argument could have. The chairman accepted the document, scanning it briefly before placing it in front of him. "Then we proceed," he said, and with that, the transition was no longer subtle. It was established, not loudly, not dramatically, but fully, and Naomi allowed herself a single breath, slow and measured, before continuing, her voice steady as ever. "There is one more point," she said, and the room, already adjusted to her rhythm, leaned into it without resistance, without question, because whatever came next, they understood now that it would not be interruption, it would be direction. Naomi did not rush the moment after she spoke, and that pause carried its own authority, quiet but deliberate, allowing the room to settle into the new rhythm she had set. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, not searching for approval, not measuring resistance, just acknowledging that every person present had now become part of what came next. "This point is not about structure," she said, her voice calm, steady, but slightly softer than before, and that subtle shift drew attention in a different way, not sharp, not procedural, but human. It is about culture. The word lingered. Unfamiliar in a room that had been defined by numbers and control, and for a moment no one responded because they were not sure how to respond. The chairman leaned back slightly, his fingers interlaced, listening with a focus that had evolved from formality into intent. Richard remained still, his gaze fixed on Naomi, but there was no interruption, no attempt to redirect, just attention, for a long time. Naomi continued. This company has operated on assumptions that are not written in policy, but are visible in behavior. She paused just enough to let the distinction land, her tone not accusatory, not emotional, just clear. Who is heard, who is overlooked, who is expected to speak, and who is expected to remain silent. A subtle shift moved through the room again, smaller this time but deeper, because the words did not point to a single decision or a single moment. They pointed to a pattern. Something that could not be dismissed as easily as a mistake. A board member at the far end shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie slightly, not out of discomfort but out of awareness, the kind that settles in when something unspoken is finally named. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, her voice steady as ever. "I am not here to assign blame," she said, and that line softened the tension just enough to keep the room open. "I am here to change what happens next." The simplicity of it held more weight than a longer explanation could have, because it left no room for argument, only for response. The chairman nodded once, slowly, acknowledging not just the words but the direction they carried. "What does that change look like?" he asked, his tone no longer distant, now fully engaged, and Naomi met his gaze directly. "It starts with visibility," she said, "clear reporting lines, transparent decision-making, and accountability that applies equally, regardless of title." Her voice did not rise, did not press. It simply moved forward, steady, grounded, and the room followed it without resistance, because by now the pattern had shifted completely. She was not interrupting their system, she was defining it. Richard exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes lowering for a fraction of a second before returning to her. And in that brief movement, there was something new. Not defeat, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when a narrative you believed in begins to unravel in front of you without force, without confrontation, just truth. "And how do you ensure that?" he asked, his voice measured, no longer dismissive, now part of the conversation rather than above it. Naomi did not hesitate. "By being present," she replied. "By not allowing assumptions to go unchallenged, even when it is uncomfortable." And the word uncomfortable settled into the room differently than anything before it, not as a threat, but as a reality, something that would exist moving forward whether they acknowledged it or not. The chairman leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting on the table, aligned with her position rather than across from it. "Then we begin there," he said. And with that, the conversation moved again, not with resistance, not with hesitation, but with a quiet acceptance that something deeper than policy had just been placed on the table, something that would shape every decision that followed. And Naomi remained still, composed, her presence unchanged, because for her, this was not a turning point. It was a continuation of something she had already decided long before she walked into the room. The room did not return to its old rhythm, and that absence was more noticeable than any reaction could have been. Because no one reached for side conversations, no one checked their watches, every movement now felt intentional, measured against the shift that had already taken place. Naomi allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to anchor what she had said before continuing, her voice calm but carrying a quiet firmness that no longer needed to prove itself. "There is one more layer to this," she said, and the words drew every eye back to her without effort. The chairman remained still, his attention fully aligned, while Richard's posture had changed in a way that would have been unthinkable minutes ago, no longer leaning back in command, but sitting upright, engaged, present, listening in a way that suggested something deeper than obligation. Naomi glanced briefly at the glass wall behind them where the reflection of the entire table shimmered faintly, then returned her gaze to the room. "Accountability only works if it is visible at every level," she continued. "Not just in reports, but in behavior, in how decisions are explained, and in how people are treated when they speak up." The phrasing was simple, but it carried weight because it echoed something everyone in the room had witnessed. even if they had never acknowledged it out loud. A board member shifted slightly, folding his hands together as if reconsidering something unspoken. The attorney who had verified the documents remained still but attentive, his tablet now resting flat on the table, no longer needed as proof, because the proof had already reshaped the room. Naomi's tone softened just slightly, not losing strength, but gaining clarity. What happened here today is not just about ownership, she said, and for a brief second her eyes moved across the faces around her, not accusing, not confronting, just present. It is about how quickly assumptions can replace facts when no one challenges them. The words settled deeper than anything before, because they did not target one person. They reflected a pattern everyone had been part of. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a moment before returning to her. And in that movement, there was no resistance left, only acknowledgement, not spoken, not declared, but visible in the way he no longer interrupted. Naomi continued without pause, her voice steady. From this point forward, every decision made in this room will be documented with clarity, reviewed with intent, and communicated without bias. She did not raise her voice, did not emphasize any single word, and that made the statement stronger because it did not ask for agreement. It established direction. The chairman nodded once, more firmly this time. That will be implemented, he said, and the words did not feel like approval. They felt like alignment. The kind that happens when leadership recognizes something real and chooses not to resist it. A quiet shift followed, not in sound but in presence, as if the room itself had adjusted to a new foundation. Richard's fingers rested flat on the table, no longer gripping, no longer signaling control, just still, and his eyes remained on Naomi, not with challenge, not with disbelief, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, not retreating, but settling into the role that had already been confirmed. Her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence no longer questioned, and for a brief moment the room held a different kind of silence, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, the kind that comes after something important has already changed and there is no need to argue it, only to accept it. And in that stillness, the meeting did not feel like it had been interrupted anymore. It felt like it had finally begun. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore, and that was the difference. It carried weight now, direction, something that had been missing before Naomi walked in. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one was reacting to her presence. They were responding to her leadership. The shift was quiet but complete. The chairman adjusted the papers in front of him, not out of habit, but to align with the new flow. "Let us proceed to the next item," he said, but his voice no longer led the room. It followed it, and that subtle change did not go unnoticed. Naomi nodded slightly, her gaze moving to the financial projections displayed on the screen at the far end of the table. Numbers and charts that had once defined the conversation now felt secondary, almost distant compared to what had just been established. "These projections assume stability," she said, her tone even. "But stability without clarity is risk." A board member leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the screen as if seeing it differently now. Not just data but implication. Naomi stood slowly, not abruptly, her movement calm and deliberate, and walked toward the screen, the soft sound of her steps echoing lightly in the room. She picked up a remote from the table and advanced the slide, revealing a breakdown that had not been included in the original presentation. "This is what was not addressed," she continued, pointing lightly, not dramatically, just enough to guide attention. "Unreviewed exposure, deferred oversight, and decisions made without full visibility." The words were not accusations, they were observations, and that made them harder to dismiss. Richard followed her movement with his eyes, his expression no longer guarded in the same way. There was something more reflective there now, something that suggested he was not just hearing her, but understanding the gaps she was revealing. "You prepared this before today," he said, his voice quieter, less certain of its own authority, and Naomi glanced back at him briefly, her expression unchanged. "I prepared it because today was inevitable," she replied, and the statement did not sound like strategy. It sounded like truth, something that had been building long before anyone in the room noticed. The attorney shifted slightly, his attention moving between the screen and Naomi, confirming silently that everything presented aligned with the documentation he had already verified. The chairman leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table, fully engaged now. "What is your recommendation moving forward?" he asked, and Naomi set the remote down gently, returning to the table without haste, her presence filling the space not by volume, but by consistency. "Immediate review of all high-exposure decisions made in the last year," she said, followed by a restructuring of approval protocols to ensure transparency at every level. Her words were clear, measured, leaving no ambiguity, and the room absorbed them without resistance, because at this point resistance would not change. What had already shifted, Richard lowered his gaze briefly to the table, his fingers brushing against the edge of the document in front of him, not gripping it, not controlling it, just touching it as if acknowledging something he could not undo. Then he looked back up, meeting Naomi's eyes directly for the first time without any trace of dismissal. "And if we find faults?" he asked, and the question did not carry challenge. It carried something closer to acceptance. Naomi held his gaze, steady, unwavering. "Then we correct them," she said simply, and the simplicity of it removed any room for avoidance, because it framed the future not as punishment, not as conflict, but as responsibility. And in that moment the room did not feel divided anymore. It felt aligned, not because everyone agreed, but because everyone understood that something fundamental had already changed, and there was no path back to what it had been before. The room did not argue with her answer, and that silence was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, chosen, because everyone present understood that the question had not been about whether faults existed, but about what would be done when they were finally seen. Naomi remained still after speaking, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture grounded, not pressing the moment forward, not forcing agreement, just allowing it to settle the way truth often does when it is no longer avoided. The chairman nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful now, no longer evaluating her authority but working within it. "Then we begin immediately," he said, and the decision did not feel like a vote. It felt like alignment, like something that had already been set into motion the moment the documents were confirmed. Richard inhaled quietly, his shoulders shifting as if adjusting to a weight that had not been there before. His eyes moved across the table, not searching for support, not measuring control, but observing the room as it now existed, a room that no longer responded to him the way it once had. And that realization did not come with resistance this time. It came with a slow, almost reluctant clarity. He leaned forward slightly. His voice, when it came, was controlled but different, less commanding, more measured. "There are ongoing negotiations tied to those decisions," he said, not as a challenge but as a consideration. Pulling them back could have consequences. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and when she responded her voice remained calm, grounded. "So could leaving them unexamined," she said. And the balance of her answer did not dismiss his concern, it reframed it, placing responsibility above convenience. The attorney glanced between them, noting the exchange not as conflict but as process, the kind that defines leadership when authority is no longer assumed but demonstrated. A board member on the far side nodded subtly, as if the direction made sense now in a way it had not before. The chairman folded his hands together, considering both perspectives before speaking again. "We will proceed with the review while maintaining stability where necessary," he said, and the phrasing bridged the gap without diluting the decision. Naomi inclined her head slightly, accepting the adjustment without resistance, because it did not weaken the structure she had set. It strengthened its application. Richard exhaled again, this time more evenly, his fingers resting flat against the table, no longer tense, no longer searching for control, just present. And for a brief moment his gaze met Naomi's again, not with challenge, not with disbelief, but with something quieter, something that acknowledged what had already shifted beyond his influence. "Understood," he said, and the word carried more weight than any argument could have, because it marked the point where resistance ended and acceptance began. Naomi did not respond to the word, did not acknowledge it directly. She simply moved forward, her attention returning to the documents in front of her. "Then we will begin with the first item on the review list," she said, her tone steady, consistent, and the room followed. without hesitation, because by now the pattern was complete. She was no longer the interruption that had entered the meeting, she was the one guiding it, and the difference was not announced, not celebrated. It was simply understood in the way every person adjusted, listened, and moved with the direction she set. And in that quiet progression, the meeting continued, not as it had been planned, but as it needed to be, shaped not by assumption but by clarity, not by control but by purpose. The first item did not feel like just another agenda point, and everyone in the room understood that before a single word was said, because now every document carried weight, every number carried consequence. Naomi slid the file forward with a steady motion, aligning it with the center of the table, not pushing it toward anyone in particular, letting it exist where everyone could see it. This decision was approved 9 months ago, she said, her tone even, controlled, without a full risk assessment. The statement was not dramatic, not loaded, just factual, and that made it harder to dismiss. A board member leaned in, scanning the summary, his brow tightening slightly as he recognized the scope. This was tied to the Westbridge expansion, he said quietly, and Naomi nodded once. Yes, she replied. And the projected return was based on incomplete data. The room shifted again, not in tension but in attention, the kind that sharpens when something previously accepted is suddenly re-examined under a different light. Richard's gaze moved to the document, his fingers brushing the edge of the table as if grounding himself in the moment. The data we had at the time supported the decision, he said, his voice steady but no longer absolute. And Naomi did not interrupt him, did not correct him mid-sentence. She let the thought finish, then responded with the same calm precision she had carried throughout. The data you had, she said, was filtered. The word landed. Quietly but carried weight, because it did not accuse directly. It revealed indirectly. The attorney glanced up from his tablet, his attention sharpening as he recognized the implication. The chairman leaned forward slightly. Filtered by whom? He asked, and Naomi's gaze moved briefly to the side of the table where a stack of reports had been placed earlier. By the reporting structure that allowed selective review, she said, her tone unchanged, which is exactly what we are correcting now. The clarity of the answer redirected the focus away from individuals and back to systems, and that shift mattered, because it prevented the room from fracturing into defense. Richard exhaled slowly, his posture still composed but more reflective. You are suggesting the decision itself was flawed, he said, not defensively, but as if testing the conclusion. Naomi shook her head slightly. I am suggesting the process was, she replied, and the distinction settled into the room with quiet force, because it separated accountability from blame, allowing the conversation to move forward instead of backward. A board member nodded subtly, his expression thoughtful. If the process was incomplete, then the outcome cannot be trusted, he said, and Naomi inclined her head in acknowledgement, not needing to repeat what had already been understood. The chairman tapped the document once with his finger, not impatiently, but as a signal of focus. Then we review it in full, he said, and this time the decision felt immediate, not delayed, not debated, just accepted. Richard's eyes moved from the document back to Naomi, and there was something different there now, not resistance, not even caution, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone sees the full scope of what they missed. What is the immediate risk exposure? He asked, and the question was no longer about defending the past. It was about understanding the present. Naomi answered without hesitation. 12% above projected tolerance, she said, her voice steady, and increasing if left unaddressed. The numbers did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. The room absorbed them without reaction, without panic, because the structure Naomi had introduced held steady, guiding the response instead of allowing it to scatter. The chairman nodded once more, firm this time. Then we begin the review with this case, he said, and the words did not just mark a step forward. They confirmed the pattern. This was no longer a conversation about whether change was needed. It was about how it would be executed. Naomi allowed a small breath to settle before she continued, her presence unchanged, her focus clear, because this moment was not about proving anything anymore. It was about building something that would not need to be proven again. No one questioned the decision, and that absence of resistance was no longer surprising. It was expected, because the structure Naomi had introduced had already replaced uncertainty with direction. She remained composed at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the documents, her posture grounded in a way that did not demand attention but held it naturally. The chairman nodded once more, his focus steady. "Then we move forward with full review protocol," he said, and the statement did not feel like an order. It felt like a confirmation of something already in motion. The attorney began organizing the files, aligning them into a sequence that matched the new process, his movements precise, efficient, reflecting the shift from reaction to structure. Richard sat quietly for a moment longer, his gaze lowered to the document in front of him. The numbers no longer abstract, no longer distant, but connected to the pattern Naomi had revealed. He exhaled slowly, then looked up. Again, meeting her eyes not with challenge, but with something closer to humility. "If the exposure increases beyond tolerance before the review is complete," he said, his voice measured, "what is the contingency?" The question carried weight because it acknowledged her authority while still engaging with responsibility. Naomi answered without hesitation, her tone steady and clear. "We pause expansion and redirect resources to stabilization," she said. "No new commitments until the review confirms alignment." The simplicity of the response carried strength because it left no ambiguity. The chairman nodded again, more firmly this time. "That will be the interim policy," he said, and the words settled into the room like a foundation being set. A board member on the far side leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "That will impact projected growth," he said, not as objection but as observation. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the reality without stepping away from it. "Short-term growth is not stability," she replied, "and stability is what sustains long-term value." The phrasing was calm but definitive, reframing the priority without dismissing the concern. The room absorbed it without resistance, because the logic was clear and the structure supporting it had already been established. Richard nodded once, slowly, as if aligning his own thinking with the direction being set, his hands resting flat on the table, no longer tense, no longer searching for control, just present. "Understood," he said again. But this time the word carried something deeper, not just acceptance but agreement. Naomi did not react to the word, did not acknowledge it directly. She simply moved forward, her attention returning to the documents. "Then we proceed with implementation," she said, and the room followed seamlessly. The attorney began outlining the next steps. The chairman reviewed the sequence, and the board members adjusted their notes, not out of habit but with purpose. The meeting no longer felt like a series of disconnected decisions. It felt like a system taking shape in real time. Naomi remained steady at the center of it, not raising her voice, not asserting her position, because it no longer needed to be asserted. It had been demonstrated. And in that quiet progression, something deeper settled into the room, not just authority, but trust, not forced, not declared, but built through clarity, consistency, and the absence of anything unnecessary. And as the discussion continued, there was no return to what had been before, no lingering doubt about who guided the room now. Only a shared understanding that the direction had changed, and that the change was not temporary, it was foundational. The meeting did not end with a dramatic close, and that was what made it final. No raised voices, no last-minute objections, just a quiet alignment that had settled into every seat around the table. The chairman gathered the documents slowly, not rushing, not signaling urgency, but marking the conclusion with the same measured control that had defined the new direction. "We will reconvene in 48 hours for progress updates," he said, and the statement carried forward momentum rather than closure. Naomi nodded once, her posture still composed, her presence steady in the chair that had once seemed unreachable. The board members began to stand one by one, not in disorder but in sequence, their movements reflecting the shift that had taken place. Conversations that would have once formed in clusters did not begin. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way they glanced toward Naomi before exiting, a subtle recognition that did not need words. Richard remained seated a moment longer than the others, his hands resting flat on the table, his gaze lowered as if tracing the lines of the document that had changed everything. The room around him emptied gradually, the sound of chairs sliding back, the soft click of shoes against the floor, the distant hum of the elevator returning to its usual rhythm, and still he did not move. Naomi gathered her papers without hurry, aligning them carefully, not out of habit, but with intention, as if every action now carried weight beyond the moment. When she finally stood, the chair behind her slid back with a soft sound that echoed lightly in the nearly empty room. Richard looked up then, meeting her eyes without hesitation, without the shield he had carried before. "I underestimated you," he said, his voice quiet, not defensive, not searching for justification, just honest in a way that had not been present at the beginning. Naomi did not respond immediately. She held his gaze for a second, not as a challenge, not as a victory, but as acknowledgement. "You did not know me," she replied, her tone calm, steady, and the distinction mattered, because it did not frame the moment as his failure. It framed it as his assumption. Richard nodded once, slowly, absorbing the weight of that difference. "That will not happen again," he said, and the words were not a promise made for appearance. They were a recognition of something learned too late to prevent the moment, but not too late to change what followed. Naomi inclined her head slightly, not accepting or rejecting the statement, simply letting it exist, because the change she had set in motion did not depend on his words. It was already in place. She turned toward the door, her steps measured, the same steady rhythm that had carried her into the room now carrying her out, and as she reached the threshold, the light from the hallway caught the edge of the glass wall, reflecting her silhouette for a brief second, not as someone who had entered out of place, but as someone who had reshaped the space itself. Behind her, Richard remained still, watching not with disbelief, not with resistance, but with a quiet understanding that what had shifted could not be reversed, and in that stillness the room felt different, not empty, but changed, the echo of the meeting lingering in the air like something that would not fade, because it was never just about ownership or authority. It was about something simpler and far more difficult to ignore, the moment when someone who had been unseen refused to remain that way and did not raise her voice to be heard. She simply stood her ground until the room learned to listen, and that was enough.